On September 12, 2023, at the international airport, a memorable incident occurred when a woman, identified as a nurse, was escorted off a flight by authorities after causing a disturbance. In an intoxicated state, she disrupted the terminal area, harassed the flight attendants, and displayed aggressive behavior toward them. The situation quickly escalated when she began recording videos and challenging the staff's attempts to intervene, even attempting to strike one of the attendants with her phone. Despite having years of flying experience and taking pride in herself, she never imagined that her actions would lead to an entirely different outcome, forcing her to face police intervention and serious legal consequences. When the woman entered the airport, it was clear she had an inflated sense of entitlement that matched her loud, gaudy presence. Her name? Completely irrelevant, as far as she was concerned. No, this was a woman who demanded to be recognized as something far more significant. Nurse Extraordinaire, a title she'd claimed for herself and displayed with all the subtlety of a neon sign. Her t-shirt, in bold, unmissable font, blared her self-appointed title to anyone within a 5-foot radius. Nurse Extraordinaire, it read, as if she were the superhero of the medical world, capable of saving lives and performing miracles, not the kind of person who could barely keep her balance in the terminal. But reality was a different story. While she strutted through the terminal, there was nothing extraordinary about her. In fact, she was highly intoxicated, her movements erratic, her eyes glossy, and her breath barely contained as she stumbled through the crowd. The nurse was far from the poised professional her t-shirt suggested. Instead, she was a chaotic mess of spilled whiskey and misguided confidence, her judgment clouded by alcohol as much as her sense of superiority. As the gate agents called for boarding, the flight attendants were busy ensuring that the boarding process went smoothly. That's when Nurse Extraordinaire caught their attention. She had somehow staggered into the cabin, a cocktail of tipsy swagger and misplaced pride. As she made her way to her seat, one of the attendants politely but firmly told her, "Ma'am, please take your seat. We're preparing for takeoff." But Nurse Extraordinaire wasn't interested in sitting quietly. She tilted her head back, her body lurching slightly as she swayed, her gaze locked on the attendant. With a defiant sneer, she said, "I'm Nurse Extraordinaire. I don't sit when I'm doing important work." She laughed to herself, swishing her drink back like a seasoned pro, then threw her hands up in dramatic flair. "Who needs to sit when the world needs to know about my greatness?" It was then that the flight attendants realized they were about to witness something they hadn't signed up for, a full-blown performance. As if her seatbelt wasn't tight enough, Nurse Extraordinaire began her one-woman show, dramatically shifting in her chair, making exaggerated hand gestures to emphasize her fabulous lifestyle. She pulled out her phone and started recording, her voice booming as she babbled on, ignoring the gentle but insistent requests from the flight attendants. No, I'm not sitting," she slurred. "Why would I sit when I'm a hero of the skies? You're just a flight attendant, but me? I'm saving lives, one bottle at a time." She almost toppled over as she leaned forward, holding her phone up like a trophy. The attendants, though clearly taken aback, tried to remain calm. They made another attempt, this time more firm, to get her to sit down. "Please, ma'am, we need you to secure your seat for takeoff. We'll be ready for departure soon." But Nurse Extraordinaire wasn't ready to relinquish control, or to stop the show. With a look of utter disdain, she pushed one of the attendants' hands away and snapped, "Don't touch me! I'm recording a video! I am the show!" Then, in a move that could only be described as a drunk person's version of a slap, she swung her phone, hard, toward the attendant's chest, as if to demonstrate her power. The flight attendant staggered back, taken off guard, not expecting to be struck with a phone as though it were a weapon. It wasn't a slap. It was more like a blunt object hit. As the nurse's phone made contact with the attendant's body, the woman's laughter echoed through the cabin, like a laugh track that no one wanted to be part of. Her actions were met with confused silence, and before anyone could react, Nurse Extraordinaire swung again, this time at another flight attendant who had come to help. She wasn't finished. She didn't care that she was in an airport or that she was a passenger. She was above the rules, or so she thought. With each swing of her phone, she made the reality clearer. This wasn't about being a nurse. This was about being a woman who had somehow convinced herself that no one could tell her what to do. That's when the chaos truly began to escalate. Her performance had gone from mildly annoying to dangerous. The attendants quickly realized that this wasn't just an irate passenger. They had a highly intoxicated woman on their hands, and if she didn't sit down soon, the situation could spiral out of control. But it was too late. Nurse Extraordinaire had already crossed a line, and now she was about to find out that, despite her title and her delusions of grandeur, no one, not even Nurse Extraordinaire, could escape the law when things went too far. As the flight attendants tried to maintain order, gently reminding Nurse Extraordinaire that this was not the Real Housewives of the Sky, the nurse's response was one for the books. In her mind, it seemed only fitting to escalate things with one of her trademark moves, taking out her phone. Not to call for help or check if she had any missed messages from her many admirers. Oh no. She was on a mission to document the injustice being done to her. With the delicate finesse of someone who clearly had too much to drink and not nearly enough self-awareness, she swiped her finger across the phone's screen. Her thumb danced dramatically, as if she were navigating a high-stakes situation, making sure to capture every second of the unjust treatment she was receiving. "This is outrageous," she muttered under her breath, her camera angle slightly askew, capturing more of the seat in front of her than the actual flight attendants. But what did that matter? The video would speak for itself. It was at this moment that one of the more courageous flight attendants, a tall woman with a no-nonsense attitude, decided she had had enough of Nurse Extraordinaire's antics. She leaned in, trying to reason with her, as calm as she could manage, with a hand extended, offering a soft but firm request. "Ma'am, please, we need to take that phone. You're disrupting the flight." This was the moment Nurse Extraordinaire had been waiting for. She wasn't just going to let some lowly flight attendant touch her precious phone. Oh no, not when she was in the middle of a documentary. With the kind of dramatic flair that would make any reality TV star proud, she snapped her hand out and swung the phone at the attendant. Not just a swing, mind you, a slap. And not just any slap. This wasn't a playful tap or a slight flick. She slapped the flight attendant across the chest with her phone as if it were an old-school weapon of choice, an extension of her entitled professional status. It was a move so ridiculous, so absurd, that for a brief second, the entire cabin seemed to freeze in disbelief. Did this really just happen? Had someone actually been slapped with a phone? The impact wasn't hard, but it was certainly enough to rattle the attendant's sense of composure. Her hand instinctively went to her chest where the slap had landed, as if to say, "Did this really just happen?" But Nurse Extraordinaire didn't give her a moment to collect herself. No, she was already on a roll, her laughter rising to a high-pitched squeal of self-satisfaction. She was untouchable after all, the nerve of anyone daring to try and stop her. "You see?" Nurse Extraordinaire slurred triumphantly, her camera still recording. "This is abuse. I'm just trying to make a statement, and they're trying to silence me. This is unbelievable." Her words came out in a wild, uncoordinated rush, as though she was trying to win an argument she didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, the flight attendants were growing more concerned about how to handle the situation. She wasn't just a disruptive passenger anymore. She was a danger to the people around her. Yet, despite her intoxication, Nurse Extraordinaire truly believed she was in the right. In her eyes, no one could touch her, not the flight attendants, not the law, and certainly not the poor person tasked with taking away her phone. And so, the scene escalated from absurd to outright dangerous. Nurse Extraordinaire, caught in her delusion of grandeur, was determined to make sure everyone knew how wronged she was, even if it meant using her phone like a makeshift weapon. Her actions weren't just an assault on authority, they were an assault on common sense. She was going to fight for her rights, even if those rights existed only in her intoxicated mind. The situation deteriorated rapidly as Nurse Extraordinaire, seemingly fueled by liquid courage and a profound sense of entitlement, took her assault game to new heights. She didn't just stop at one flight attendant. Oh no, she decided that if she was going to make an impact, she'd need to leave a trail of digital destruction in her wake. Her phone, once a tool of documentation, became her weapon of choice, a chaotic extension of her bravado. Strike one. The first flight attendant, trying to hold it together, was knocked back as Nurse Extraordinaire swung the phone toward their arm, delivering a slap that was less about precision and more about brute force. It wasn't a tactical move. There was no careful calculation. It was pure, unfiltered rage, as if Nurse Extraordinaire was trying to operate on the crew without a license. The strike was more chaotic than surgical, but it didn't matter. She felt like she was in control. Strike 2. A second flight attendant, attempting to step in and grab her arm to de-escalate the situation, became the next target. This time, Nurse Extraordinaire was determined to make her point. The phone made contact with the attendant's shoulder in a sideways slap, sending it ricocheting with force. In her mind, she was cutting through all of the so-called rules, as if the very act of swinging a phone made her a master of combat. She was untouchable, a woman who had taken an oath to help people, and surely that would mean she was exempt from the consequences of her own actions. After all, wasn't she trained in the art of saving lives? Wasn't she better than the rest? Strike 3. The third flight attendant, having seen enough, stepped in to try and subdue her. But Nurse Extraordinaire, her senses dulled by alcohol and inflated ego, wasn't backing down. She swung the phone once more, connecting with the attendant's chest, knocking them back. With every strike, she seemed to believe that she was sending a message to the world, that her professional title made her invincible. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a force to be reckoned with. But in reality, the attendants were simply trying to contain her without anyone getting hurt. Their hands were tied, caught between trying to handle an intoxicated passenger and trying to keep things from escalating into full-blown chaos. Little did they know, they were dealing with a woman who thought she was above reproach. She didn't realize that all her training had taught her to care for others, not to escape the consequences of her own bad decisions. The tipping point came when the captain, realizing the flight wasn't going to land smoothly for anyone, hit the radio and called for airport security. He had hoped that the situation would have been manageable, but no, Nurse Extraordinaire had gone full throttle into the realm of public disturbance. The police arrived, expecting a minor altercation, but instead walked into a drama of epic proportions. At first, they tried to assess the situation calmly, but what they encountered was a woman so wrapped up in her own inflated sense of self-importance that it felt like they had walked into a hostage situation. Except the hostage was her own dignity, which she wasn't about to surrender without a fight. Her face flushed with fury. She planted herself firmly in place, as if her refusal to move was some kind of power play. "I've been flying for years!" she shrieked, her words slurring together. "You don't know who I am!" She threw her arms up in a dramatic display, the phone still clutched tightly in her hand. "I'm a nurse! I'm above the law!" she declared, as if being a nurse bestowed upon her some magical immunity from any and all consequences. At this point, the officers were just trying to get her under control, but Nurse Extraordinaire wasn't going to make it easy for anyone. As the officers stepped forward to restrain her, she flailed, swatting at them with the same phone she had used to attack the flight attendants. It was like watching a toddler with a temper tantrum, but with much higher stakes. The officers, unfazed, calmly stepped aside, making sure to avoid her erratic swings, as they explained that no one, not even a nurse, was exempt from the law. But Nurse Extraordinaire couldn't hear reason. Her mind was already a whirlwind of righteous indignation. She thought that her title alone could protect her, that her career had somehow elevated her beyond the reach of legal consequences. Little did she know, her above-the-law mentality was about to crash harder than her phone ever could. The officers closed in, and as they moved to cuff her, she let out one final cry. "You'll regret this. I'm a nurse. I save lives." But in that moment, it became clear that Nurse Extraordinaire's biggest patient was herself, and the law was about to administer a dose of reality she would not forget. As the officer moved to secure Nurse Extraordinaire, the battle began in earnest. She resisted with the kind of flailing chaos one might expect from a toddler who'd just been told it's time for bed, only of course with significantly more alcohol in her bloodstream. Her body contorted in ways that no one would ever describe as graceful. Her legs kicked out like she was attempting some sort of impromptu interpretive dance, while her arms swung in all directions, as though she was auditioning for a spot in the circus, if the circus was called Unruly Passenger with a Phone. "I'm not resisting!" she yelled, her voice high-pitched and frantic, as if somehow the words themselves could make it all magically disappear. But the officers, as calm and steady as a rock, continued their efforts to restrain her. She fought back like a cat being shoved into a bath, paws scratching, fur flying, and a chorus of indignant yowls echoing through the airport. It was as if she believed that by shouting loud enough, by flailing harder, by somehow claiming that she wasn't resisting, the entire situation could be reversed. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice now reaching that panicked pitch that one might associate with someone who truly thought they were invincible. "I demand a lawyer!" she howled. The very mention of a lawyer seemed to her like an impenetrable shield, one that might deflect the handcuffs, the charges, the mess she had created. Surely her years of nursing experience would earn her some kind of judicial reprieve. But as she floundered, her struggles only compounded the situation. Each time she swiped at an officer or kicked at their legs, the charges against her mounted: assault, public intoxication, resistance to arrest. She didn't realize it, but every thrash of her arms, every wild declaration of her innocence, was just building a case that would leave her in more trouble than she could ever imagine. One officer, exasperated but professional, tried to explain the legal process to her. "You're under arrest for," he began, but she cut him off before he could finish. She was far too absorbed in recounting her storied history of air travel. "I've been flying for years. You don't understand. I've never had anything like this happen before," she ranted, as if a flight record from 1998 somehow excused her present behavior. "I'm a nurse. I save lives." The officer, trying to remain calm, nodded as she continued, unaware of the irony in her words. Here she was, someone who had spent years helping others, now being dragged away because of her inability to help herself. The real comedy came at the height of her defiance, when the officer finally succeeded in getting her restrained and started to move her toward the door. "What's happening?" she exclaimed, her voice cracking as the realization hit her that she was losing the battle. "I'm so sorry, I'm just really drunk." And there it was, the irony that could not have been scripted better. A woman who had spent her life saving people, offering wisdom and care, was now confessing, not to any higher moral calling, but to the undeniable truth. She was, in fact, just another victim of her own bad choices. Drunk, yes, but also entitled, defiant, and perhaps most tragically, in denial. The same woman who had spent years commanding respect in a hospital ward now found herself at the mercy of the police, unable to command anything but scorn and the sound of a handcuff click. Her mind, clouded by intoxication, seemed to think that the same authority she wielded in her medical career could somehow translate into immunity from arrest. But, much to her dismay, the legal system wasn't as pliable as her former patients. The officers, undeterred by her protests, continued to move her through the airport like a stubborn cart of medical supplies. And with each step, Nurse Extraordinaire's reputation, once pristine, continued its downward spiral, landing her in a place where no amount of training, no amount of history, and no amount of shouting would change the fact. She had crossed the line. And as she was led away, still kicking and screaming, she could only reflect on one thing: how terribly, tragically wrong her "I'm above the law" attitude had been. As the officers finally managed to get Nurse Extraordinaire into custody, she wasn't ready to concede defeat just yet. In what could only be described as her magnum opus of defiance, she pulled off a final act of resistance that was equal parts absurd and impressive. Twisting and contorting her body in every direction like a human pretzel, she somehow found a way to make herself an even more difficult target. Her legs were kicking in the air while her arms flailed like windmill blades in a storm. Her nurse's uniform, once pristine and presumably full of authority, was now a crumpled mess, hanging off her body like a disheveled flag of protest. But did she care? Not in the slightest. She was going down in a blaze of glory, her phone held high as though it were the final piece of evidence in her "I'm untouchable" defense. In that moment, she was no longer just a woman trying to avoid arrest. She was an unintentional martyr for the cause of "I can't be arrested." Her phone, now clutched like a weapon of mass resistance, remained pointed at the officers and flight attendants alike. It was almost as if she thought recording her own arrest would somehow make it all go away, as though the viral video would somehow clear her name. Meanwhile, the flight attendants, shaken but surprisingly amused, couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of the situation. The seriousness of their work was no match for the farcical spectacle unfolding before them. These professionals had dealt with unruly passengers before, but never had they imagined that their most unpredictable, chaotic passenger would be a nurse, the very symbol of care, control, and professionalism. She had gone from the healer of the sick to the embodiment of the out-of-control drunk, and the irony of it was not lost on them. As Nurse Extraordinaire was finally dragged into the back of the squad car, the flight attendants exchanged knowing glances, shaking their heads in disbelief. They had seen a lot of things in their time at 30,000 feet, but this was a first. They had endured complaints, rude passengers, and the occasional temper tantrum, but never had they expected that a nurse would turn out to be their most unpredictable and most dramatic encounter. For Nurse Extraordinaire, though, the lesson was harsh and clear. She had spent her career dressing in a white coat, a symbol of authority and trust. But in the end, no coat, no title, and no amount of bluster could save her from the reality that the law doesn't care what's embroidered on your shirt. In the end, just because you're a nurse doesn't mean you're above the law. And in the cold, hard reality of being arrested in the airport, Nurse Extraordinaire learned the most painful lesson of all. Sometimes the only thing a white coat can save you from is the embarrassment of thinking you were invincible. In the end, the story of Nurse Extraordinaire concluded not with praise for courage or skill, but with a profound lesson about humility and respect for common rules. No matter who she was or how many titles she carried, no one is above the law. This story is not just a humorous event, but a reminder that, no matter how respected one may be in society, arrogance and a disregard for others will inevitably lead to unavoidable consequences. And ultimately, whether you're a doctor or a flight attendant, no one can exempt themselves from the fairness of the law.